Yeah, so for backyard composting, we have a lot of information on our website, ccebroomcounty.com/environment/composting. And we have a bunch of lists of handouts for there to help you get started and with all the information that we're going to be talking about today about backyard composting. All right. I want to start with the why of composting. And
well, hang on, Josh. Do you want to do the poll first?
Let's remember the polls. So have you in your mind like why you're composting, and we want to send out this poll so we have a good sense of where everyone's at with composting and relationship with composting, so I can help guide us all through and answer the points that we're all thinking about. So yeah, so here goes the poll. We have a few questions there. What is your level of activity with composting? So if you've started already, you can put that down if you're new to it or if you haven't started at all. What's your interest level as to your why of why you're composting? Your living situation, which will help determine what system you'll have, and I can talk about that a little bit later. And then your worries about starting composting or worries about your current compost pile. All right, about halfway there. We can get a few more folks to put in their answers. And if nothing really specifically fits you, that's totally fine. Pick the one that it's closest to. We just want to have a general sense of where everyone's at. All right. Give you a little bit more time. All right, so it looks like we have most people in, so we'll end the polling. We'll share the results. So we have some folks, more than half of us are already composting. That's great, lovely. Then we have about a third of us are new to composting. Wonderful, welcome. Hopefully this helps you out. Trackpad's a little rough. So 2, describe your interest in composting. To create and use in your garden, that's great to hear. I know I'm starting a garden this year in my community garden, and composting is a big help with that and making sure there's enough nutrients in there for the plants to grow. And yeah, so a split between that and reducing the food scraps in your trash, which is great. Living situation, all right, you're able to use your backyard, great. This will be great help to you. For those that don't, this is still good information. You can help your neighbors that might be able to collaborate. We also have some information about vermicomposting, which is a good indoor system that you can have in your apartment and for other places that you can't use your backyard. And for worries about it. Not being successful, I totally understand, as it being a new endeavor for you and not really knowing exactly how it's going to go. It's difficult, but it's an art and a science, and it's something that you just have to work with and build a relationship for it to go well. And yeah, and these steps will help you get there and to address other issues, including smells, because it shouldn't be a smelly process at all. If you're doing it right, then you'll be learning how to do it right today. So, great, so stop sharing that. Now we can get into the whole presentation, and as Christina mentioned, I'll try to stop throughout so you can ask some questions, but if there's anything really burning, just unmute yourself, raise your hand or something, or just let us know. That'd be great, and we can address it then. So, the reason for composting, it saves some landfill space. Everything we put into our garbage can and we take to the curb is trucked up to the landfill, the Broome County landfill. We have our own. And with all the weight and such, it puts a wear on the trucks and the roads, and food scraps have a lot of water. So they're pretty heavy. So it adds to the weight of the trash, which is demonstrated in the far right here
Hello.
with this percentage with the pie chart.
Okay, I'll be right down.
28% by weight.
Okay, alrighty.
Scraps and compost.
Have to leave.
Catch you later then. So, yeah, there's 28% of the pie chart, or of the weight of trash, is compostable materials, which includes food scraps and yard waste. And the rest of it is the non-compostable, which also includes recycling and such, which is about another third of weight. So with composting and recycling, you can really cut down what is sent to the landfill. At the landfill, with food scraps and other organic materials, plants and stuff, if they're put in there, they're compacted to make as much room as possible. And when that compaction happens, it creates methane and odors and bad smells. Kind of like leaving your leftovers in your refrigerator in the back there for a couple weeks in an airtight container, where you open it up and it's some strange colors and it smells weird. That's the anaerobic stuff, the no air organisms at work, and we don't want that. Your compost shouldn't smell. Sorry, that was a whole separate thing. Reduced need for fertilizers. So composting is kind of like nature's way of recycling. And in this case, we're recycling the nutrients in the plants and the fruits and vegetables that we put in there back into the soil, so we can grow more plants that we can use, and then we can compost, put it into our soil and grow and keep going around and around like that. Recycling, but composting, like nature's way of recycling. And adding compost also helps the soil, both health and structure, so it's able to retain more moisture, more water, so you don't have to ideally water as often, and retains more water. And also creates more air pores, so the plants can breathe and also get more oxygen into the roots, which is helpful for them. And it really helps keep down the non-helpful microorganisms, right? So it introduces healthier populations of beneficial microorganisms, which helps suppress any other diseases and such. So that's why you want to add compost to either your garden or your yard. And what's also important, but sometimes overlooked, is it's a part of a waste reduction strategy. So composting and recycling are great, but as we know, there's 3 R's. There's reduce, reuse, recycle, and those 3 are in order of importance. And reducing is at the top of the list. And to highlight that, we have this chart that should be showing up at some point, the food recovery hierarchy. And it has the source reduction at top, which means you're using what you're buying, and it's just cost effective, but it also helps the environment too. Even if you are composting, it's better to eat what you have rather than to recycle it. And then down at the bottom, you can see the source reduction, feeding people, giving food away. If it's still good food, but you're unable to get to it, give it to a friend, family member, someone that you can, that will be able to use it. And then these ones, not so much applicable in the home composting or the home setting, but just to reiterate that composting is at the bottom, but it's still better than landfilling, so don't get that mixed up. You do want to compost over landfill, but more importantly, reduce your food waste as much as possible. There's some good stuff out there, like SaveTheFood.com can help you learn how to properly store your fruits and vegetables. Different fruits and vegetables need different environments to extend their shelf life, so you can look into that as a way to reduce your food waste. So to composting, what is it? It's the controlled aerobic decomposition of organic materials. So we have air in the pile that's breaking down things that used to grow. So old plants, dead plants, material, food scraps, and leaves for the most part. And that's going to turn not into soil directly, but it's what's called a humus. So it's a soil additive, which gives it the benefits because it's all organic material. With the soil, there's a certain percentage of inorganic materials in there. So when you mix those two together, you get healthy soils. In composting, as I said before, it's a natural process. And there's a lot of players involved that make this happen. I've been talked about microorganisms briefly, so that includes bacteria and fungi, and they're hard at work in the moisture of the pile. And they're the ones that really start the breakdown process. What we're most accustomed to seeing and knowing as decomposers are worms. And they help. You can have a whole worm bin inside your apartment and have them break everything down. But for the outdoor setting, they kind of come later and help finish off the composting. Same with the sow bugs, pill bugs, stuff like that. But the bacteria, fungi are really the ones that are getting things going. Any questions so far as to the whys of composting or how we're framing composting? Just want to give a quick check-in. If not, I'll move on to the ingredients, the stuff that we're putting into our compost. Most commonly in our backyards, we have fallen leaves. These are very helpful. They're high in carbon, so you want to store these as much as you can. Either if you don't have a tree in your backyard, get them from a friend if possible. And of course, this is kind of planning ahead to fall rather than right now. But yeah, you'll want to collect those maybe in like plastic bags, keep them dry as much as possible so you can use it in your pile throughout the year. You want fallen leaves, fruit and vegetable scraps. So the peels, the pips and the cores, the rinds, you can keep all of those. And the kind of mushy, sort of moldy stuff, also those. But fruit, I want to emphasize fruit and vegetables, and not so much like meats, dairies, and fats. You don't want those in there. Those are fairly smelly. But just keep in mind the fruits and vegetables. Yard and garden waste. The trimmings and the cuttings, those can go in there. Those are great. Green materials, we'll talk a little bit more later. Shredded newspaper, cardboard, and straw. Similar with fallen leaves. Since they came from trees, of course, and the saying that I usually have, if it grows, it goes into your compost bin. And that includes all the paper products because they came from trees, and so they can be added into your compost pile. And of course, we need water and air for those microorganisms to do their thing. Because we're basically making a mounding buffet for these microorganisms. You can kind of think of ourselves as microorganism farmers almost. We're just making conditions right for them to break everything down. And you can also put it in grass clippings too. So instead of collecting them, putting them in a bag and setting it to the curb to be collected, you can either, what I would do, it's kind of the lazy way, just when you're going over with the mower, just leave them on the lawn and they'll break down, they'll help in their own way there. Or if you're unable to get it for a while and it grows real tall, then you can rake it up and then put it into your compost bin too. So you can compost with just leaves and grass clippings as well. That'll be just fine. So, yeah. As we've said before, do not compost these things, mostly for the smell. And I did say if it grows, it goes, and you could argue animals grow, and I would agree. Yeah, you can like raise animals and such. But in the backyard system, it's not set up to break those kinds of things down. So meats and cheeses, they will end up being smellier than anything. Like they won't be processed properly in our backyard setting. So we recommend not including those at all. Including like bones, because those are really tough fibrous materials, take a long time to break down. And bones for sure will take, they just won't in your backyard bin, unfortunately. And fats and grease, same situation, is mostly the smell. So don't be pouring your extra ranch dressing on your compost bin. You just want to stick with fruits and vegetable scraps and leaves and maybe some of the other stuff, but don't compost these things. Any questions about what can and can't go into the compost bin? Yeah, you have a question?
Sorry, I have a question, about weeds. So a lot of community gardens right now are weeding their gardens.
Mhm.
What thoughts do you have on including weeds or weeds with seeds in the compost bin?
Weeds with seeds, that's a no-go. We don't want to give the seeds the opportunity to grow because when they do, they will, if that makes sense. If you know your weeds well enough and you're able to pick them before they go to seed, and if they're not the ones that automatically grow, if they just happen to touch the ground, you can add those in. As an extra safety measure, you can lay them out flat in the sun for a day, let them dry, and then add them in. But I'm always kind of cautious about weeds. Um, but if you know they're not going to seed, they should be good to go.
Yeah, I think I tell a lot of the gardeners, as far as weeds go, if you know that your compost is not going to get too hot, best thing to do is to put them in a plastic garbage bag for a day or two, and then put them in. Let them cook.
Yeah, we just want to make sure they're not going to grow anymore, because they will grow and things might grow in the compost bin. That's totally fine. That's totally natural. But you don't want weeds. You don't want weeds in there.
We have a question from the chat box from the Johns.
All
They
right.
want to know about citrus fruit in the compost bin. Yes or no?
My opinion is of yes. I wouldn't, if you're juicing a whole lot, just kind of keep an eye out for it and see if it is breaking down in your bin. But it should break down. And to help facilitate breakdown, if you don't mind me going back, is to kind of chop up everything into smaller bits. Because with the ingredients, leaves included, if you shred your leaves and chop up your food scraps into small pieces, they'll break down even more quickly. The higher surface area, it's easier for the microorganisms to get to. Kind of like with, you have like a rotten apple, a classic example, with the worm in it. The outside of it, most of it looks fine because the skin is still intact. But the worm might have found this one little hole that it was able to burrow through, and then it's eating the inside, which is mostly water, really. So you want to break down the tough exterior, maybe the skins and the peels, as much as possible to increase the surface area to make it quicker to break down. Yeah.
We have a few more questions from the chat box. Can you take them?
Yeah, right now?
Yep. So we have a question from Kathy Jones. She's asking, can you toss a paper filter with the coffee grounds into the compost?
Yes, you can. Coffee grounds and the paper filters are good. That's what we do at our office. We get the coffee grounds from the Taste New York store. So when you get your delicious coffee from there, the coffee grounds are composted on site. Then just mix those with leaves too, because they're also a green, which we'll talk about later. But they're helpful. They're beneficial for sure. When you dump everything in, you're gonna want to lay it like flatten it out, kind of. You don't want to have like mounds or clumps of everything, because when you have like just like a clump of food waste, then there's no air getting into the middle. So it kind of has to be, and it has to be in a kind of thin layer, like maybe an inch or two thick in the pile. But yeah, coffee grounds, put those in for sure.
Excellent. And then we have another question from Robert Stephen Daniker. The question is, should eggshells go in? And if so, can they go in raw or should they be baked in the oven first?
Mm-hmm. What you can do is give them like a quick rinse, just so you don't get any odors from the inside of the eggshell. And then if you can, crush them up a little bit. Those can be composted. It's a source of calcium that can be used in the soil. You might still be able to see little chunks here and there, but that's not going to be harmful, really, and when applied to the garden. So eggshells, yes. Cool.
Great. I don't think that there are any other questions in the chat box right now.
All right.
You guys,
Wait a minute.
questions coming, please.
Wait a minute. From Facebook, can you compost Trader Joe's bags?
Trader Joe's bags.
Like the paper bags?
Yeah.
I believe so.
So with the paper products, we said we could put in there in the cardboard. I would shred those up really fine. That is assuming, definitely recycle and reuse first. I want to throw that out there. If you can do those, that'd be a whole lot better. But if you can't and you have to compost them, like if it's, then you'd want to rip it up into as small chunks as possible. Because it's really tough, because it's still mostly tree, because it's just the lignin, it's just the tough fibers from the tree. It's very difficult for it to break down if it's still a full sheet. So shred it as much as possible, then add it in. Cool. So for all these, I was kind of saying carbon, nitrogen, greens and browns. We'll clarify that here on this page. So the dry stuff, like the leaves, the straw, the wood shavings, and the paper bag, those are called browns. And their browns are high in carbon. And for the pile, we're trying to balance carbon and nitrogen here, which is the wet stuff, AKA the greens. So to go that over again, the dries are browns, high in carbon. The wets, the green stuff, they're high in nitrogen. And we want to balance those. And the balance is roughly 3:1. So that's by volume. You can do a lot of math if you want to get technical with composting, and especially you'd want to if you have a large-scale composting operation. But for the backyard composting, this is a good start. It's 3 parts, or like 3 handfuls of browns to 1 rough handful of food waste. So that will allow the carbon and the nitrogen to be in balance. And that's the food and the fuel that the microorganisms need to break everything down. The wet, the green stuff, the high in nitrogen, they also carry some moisture with them. So like if you can imagine, the coffee grounds will still have a lot of water in them and the moisture. The dries of the browns will soak that up. So nothing's going to be sopping wet. Like if you have just a pile of food scraps and they're all like really wet food scraps, they're going to compress. There's not going to be any air pockets because the water is taking up that space. And then when it's compressed, there's no air. That's when it smells, and that's when methane's produced. And we don't want that to happen. So we need to add in some brown materials to even out the carbon and the nitrogen, but also to balance out the moisture. To do that, we promote lasagna layering, adding browns to make kind of a bowl. It's kind of tough to see, but in this first figure, right in the middle, they have a little bowl where they put leaves up on the sides, so you won't see the food scraps from the sides of the bin. You'll add the greens into that bowl. So you have the bowl here, adding the greens, and then you're going to cover with the browns. On all sides, the food scraps are covered. It's going to reduce the smell of fresh food scraps to help deter pests, but then also get that mixture to get that balance correct. So that's what we call lasagna layering, and you keep adding layer by layer until your bin is filled, and then you let that all break down. It's a really good system for home composting because you can continually add to it. That's generally how we make our food scraps, right? It's like we prepare some dish, we have a little bit of scraps, maybe potato peelings or carrot tops or something like that, and then we can add those in as we make them. So lasagna layering, helpful, would recommend for your backyard composting bin. And it also helps with the structure too. With the browns, with the leaves too, they help create those air pockets. So right here in this pile, you can see the little white, that's the air, those air pockets. And the blue is kind of the air flowing through the bin. I know the fresh air will come in through the sides. And then all the heat, all the action, the party the microorganisms are having is like right in the middle. So that's where there's more heat, where a lot of the decomposition is happening. Right there, and then that'll draw air up and through. Oh, I wasn't ready for that one. I apologize, I hit a wrong button, but we'll get back there. Okay. So this is the structure of the bin that we need to help keep things moving, keep it aerated, keep it aerobic, so it doesn't smell, and it'll just break down. And over here, you can see it's a kind of squat pile, what we talked about before, where there's probably more green materials than there are brown. Their ratio is off, and the structure isn't there, so it's probably going to smell. But you don't have to worry about that because you can have your pile the right balance with lasagna layering. That makes sense. Any questions about lasagna layering? All right.
Are there any new questions that I can see?
Okay. So moisture. We mentioned that some of the greens are bringing in moisture to the pile, but sometimes we might have to add moisture too. We want to keep an ideal moisture around 40 to 60%. So it's kind of like a wrung out sponge, that kind of level of moisture. And over to the left here, this is something that's what we're looking for. The leaves aren't 100% dry. They're holding some water along with some of the greens here. So that's about what you're looking for. Now you don't have to necessarily reach your hand in and then give it a squeeze, although that's a good test. Give the squeeze test. And if you do, there should only be maybe a couple drops, but nothing more than that. But you can also just kind of do it by eye. And also, another saying is your nose knows. So if it smells off, something is off. And it's probably the moisture. You probably have too much if it smells bad, or you don't have the right pockets. So yeah, kind of having a relationship with your composting bin, and composting is an art and also a science. That the art part is getting to know your bin and implementing all senses, as many senses as possible to check up on it. Yeah, if the moisture is too low, it's not going to break down, or it's going to be very slow at breaking down. Too much, similarly, but it'll also have odors. So you want to keep it around 40 to 60%. For your bin location matters too. If it's in the sun, it'll dry out more quickly. And depending on the bin, if it's more exposed on all sides, it could dry out on all sides too. In addition to adding your greens, you might also have to get a watering can to achieve the proper moisture. And of course, if you add too much moisture in there, you add in more dry materials, more browns, to soak everything up, and then get it back into balance with the moisture level. So turning the pile. We said before with the pile, a lot of the breaking down is happening in the middle and not so much on the sides, because the sides aren't as insulated as the middle is. So we want to turn our pile to make sure that all the materials get a chance to be the life of the party. They're in the center, having the center of attention, getting the heat and the microorganism activity for it to break down. It introduces air into the pile. Over time, you will notice that your pile might have started here, but over maybe a few days to a couple weeks, it'll diminish in size, maybe by a third. And that's when you know the process is working, but you'll also want to turn it to introduce more air so it doesn't compress, because we don't want the gases and we don't want the stench. We don't want the pile to stink. You can do it with a pitchfork. You can turn it with a pitchfork, which is a good way of doing it. If you're unable to, you can have a composting turning tool, which we use a lot in our creation site, where it is.
Oh, how did you know to do that?
Hang on one second.
And then, yep.
I know, but I didn't hear your phone ping, so I was like, how did you know you?
Yeah, okay. For the turning tool, you put the pole into the compost bin, and then the wings flap out as you pull it out of the pile, and that helps fluff things up and introduces more air into the pile. It's less energy intensive than turning the whole pile with a pitchfork, and it's a good intermediate step to getting more air in there.
We
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Question?
I don't mean to interrupt. We have a question from Tammy, Philip, and Natalie, which I think is connected to this. They said, if the pile does start to smell, what do you do?
If it does smell, that probably means there's too much moisture and or there's too many greens to browns. So your balance is off. You're gonna wanna add more dry material in there and then turn it all together to make sure it's soaking it up. It's possible that in the middle it's just starting to get compacted, so you're gonna wanna fluff it up. So if it smells, add more browns in there and then keep your nose peeled and the smell should go away. If it doesn't, it means something's still off and you'll have to add some more browns to it. So for a pile versus bin, we talked about what goes into it. So let's talk about how to make this whole composting structure. You can have a pile. I had a pile for a little bit when I was growing up. What happens with a pile, it kind of starts here, but then it flattens out. And it doesn't get to a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, which is the recommended dimensions of a composting bin. So 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet at minimum. A bin helps achieve that. Okay. So we have a couple examples of bins here. We want level ground. For your siting your compost bin, you want level ground or slightly sloping ground. Nothing too severe because you don't want your pile to be off-centered and fall over if you build it up to 3 feet or so. But gently sloping just to make sure there's runoff because we don't want water pooling at the bottom. When you get standing water, it takes up the air pockets, and with air comes smell. Well, with water taking up the air pockets, no air, it smells. The level ground to slightly sloping is ideal. I wouldn't recommend putting your compost bin right underneath a tree where the roots can easily get to it. Or if you do, you're gonna have to move it about every year because trees are smart and they're hungry and the roots will find your composting bin. And if you leave it in one spot, the roots will grow up into it because it's really nutritious, great snack for them. So they'll kind of take up the space there. You'll want to move your pile or just find a different location so your compost bin isn't too close to trees. And the shade versus a sunny location, both are fine as long as you're paying attention to the moisture level. And of course, in the sun, it might dry out, so you might have to add water more often. In the shade, it might retain a little bit more moisture, but either way, you should keep your eyes peeled for that. So both are fine. Level ground, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. You can go up to 5 feet by 5 feet by 5 feet. That's about maximum manageable level with a pitchfork. So in between those is perfectly fine. And making a bin, there's a whole lot of different options out there. A popular one, a fairly inexpensive option is a wire mesh bin, where you can get about 1/4 inch hole wire mesh for about 12 feet, wrap it around so it's a 3 foot diameter, and then start building from there. The holes in the mesh allow for good airflow on all sides, which is what we want in our pile. And it's all about maybe 25, 30 bucks to make. So pretty cheap. You don't need too extensive carpentry skills to make it. It's a pretty simple setup and it's fairly robust. So it's a good option for starting out. You can also do pallet bins, which is what we have at some Vines community gardens, including mine. It's a quick setup. If you're able to find some pallets for free, set them on their side, get 3 of them at least, and boom, you have a composting bin already. And it's about 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet, roughly. They're not square, of course, but it's another quick and pretty inexpensive way to make a bin. And you can put one on the front too, so you can build up a little bit higher. But without having the front, it's easier access, so you can turn it and add to it. If pests are what you're worried about, you might want to try a Fort Knox bin. This is a picture taken from Ithaca, and what they have done is in the front they have the slats, so you can't really see into the front there, and they also have a lid on a hinge, pretty hefty lid that comes down, so nothing can get in through the top, and the sides are wire mesh. So it's, you can kind of think of it as a mix between the welded wire bin and the pallet bin, just with more carpentry involved. And so it's very difficult for any animals to burrow through because nothing can really chew through the welded wire. So if you have it on all sides and a lid on top, nothing can get in on the sides or the top. And also, you can have wire mesh at the bottom, so nothing can burrow up and into the bin. So that's why we call it the Fort Knox, because it's tough for the creatures to get into. However, this is a more expensive option. One of these bays is about at least several $100, depending on the lumber that you use, of course, where they went for very rot resistant lumber, natural woods. So the price is going to be a little bit higher. And same with the pallet bins, you can also use pressure treated wood because they use heat treated, but you can double check with the stamps on there to make sure that's heat treated. And that'll be fine to use for your composting bin, and it'll keep your compost will be fine if you use pressure treated wood. We talked about turning, how turning is important, but it can be labor intensive. These types of bins, these tumbling bins, try to make it easier by having either like in the middle, and I have a whole drum and a handle with a crank. So it'll turn the compost bin, which will turn what's inside and mix everything together for you. So you don't need a pitchfork or a turning tool, and it's enclosed, so it's a lot less likely for creatures to get into it. There's homemade alternatives. There's this alternative for purchase for a couple $100. And then one that you can roll around, which is kind of like a tumbling bin. So that's kind of fun. If these work for you, if you're super worried about pests, this could be great. However, they work kind of better in batches and not as much for like adding scraps continually. But that's just one consideration to make. You can save up your food scraps in a freezer or refrigerator space and then add large portions at a time to compost everything. And that's, I think, would work well with these tumbling bins. But yeah, just another option. So the common issues and solutions, just to go over what we discussed: wet, soggy, and slimy. There's too much water or too many greens, so you're going to want to add dry browns to it. If it's dry and dusty and nothing's happening, nothing's breaking down, there's probably not enough moisture, so you might have to add more water, or the balance between greens and browns is off, and you might have to add more water and more greens, and then kind of mix everything together to get air going, and then you should be able to see increased activity. If it smells bad, same with the wet, soggy, and slimy, just add more browns. Slow to decompose or pests. As long as you're doing the lasagna layering and you're building up the sides you can't see the food scraps anywhere, you're unlikely to get anything digging through. If you do see anything like mites or little pill bugs, sow bugs in there, those are totally normal and you do want those. They're helpful, but yeah, those are like the good pests, but raccoons and such, not so great. If you do get those, I will say, I would recommend saving up your food scraps and stop composting for a bit, or stop adding to it for a while until they don't associate that with a continual source of food, because you don't want to just keep feeding them, right? So they'll keep coming back. So if you just stop for maybe a month or so when they aren't continuing to visit your bin, then you can start up again and then make extra sure, and maybe add extra ground materials to cover it up to keep the smell down so you don't attract new pests. There's alternative methods to composting too. You can just trench it. If you have a lot of yard space or a lot of garden space that isn't being used, you can dig down about 8 inches, add your food waste. I'd add it probably lower than what they have, what's pictured here, but this is more for visual. And then cover it back up. And then over several months, it'll break down. Then you can plant on top of it. Sheet composting, that doesn't really deal with your food waste as much, but it's a good way to prep a garden space for the next season by layering newspaper and cardboard, wet them down, and then just let them sit for a while. But yeah, there's other alternatives to composting too. So what I wanted to hopefully get across is that there's a lot of different systems, and while that can be daunting at times, there is a bin and a system that will work for your situation. But yeah. For the finished compost, it should look something like this. If you want to make it look like store ready, you can make a little shifting mechanism, put it through some screen. So it takes out all the bigger pieces like the straw or the undecomposed leaves before you add it to your garden. But all of that is good to go. It'll be dark, brown, and crumbly, and it'll smell like earth. One way to double check that it's ready is to just let it sit. You're gonna wanna let the compost cure. Even if it looks ready from your bin and you know it was like newly formed compost, you're gonna wanna let it sit and cure for a little bit, because those microorganisms, they're in the after party right now. It looks like the whole party's over, everything's decomposed, but there's still some stragglers there. And if you add it too early, they'll actually take up some nutrients in the soil so your plants can't use it. They take away the nitrogen. And so your plants are kind of starved. And you don't want to do that. You want to help your plants. So you can help them by curing your compost for about a couple months, just letting it sit, letting the microorganisms balance themselves out before adding it to your garden or your lawn. Yeah. And uses for compost, you can just add it straight to your soil, mix it in with like a raised bed. You want to put maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch per year of compost. And because it's mostly organic material, it'll break down and slowly release nutrients over the whole season, which is great. You can also use it as a mulch. If you just put it right on top of your garden around the roots, you can top dress it, and it'll help suppress weeds as well if you don't mix it in. And for tea, not to drink, of course. I wouldn't recommend drinking compost, but you can suspend compost in some water and the nutrients will leach out, and then you can use it for your houseplants. So even if you don't have like the garden space to add your compost, you can use a tea instead and use it for your indoor plants, which is a great alternative. Cool. So final thoughts. There is a system that'll work for you. Outdoor bin, they come in different sizes, and there's different levels and different costs and price points that you can look into, from the free pallets to the welded wire to like Fort Knox situation, depending on the resources you have available and your handiness, or someone you know that's handy enough to make a bin. There's a bin that'll work for you. Collect your leaves as much as possible, and your neighbor's leaves. Put them in a plastic bag, keep them dry throughout the year so you can add them and use them as your brown materials in your compost, because you want 3 parts brown for every 1 part green, so you're going to need a lot of leaves for this. Or you can also use straw, which is more readily available, which you could purchase, which is also a good brown alternative. Do the lasagna layering, so you're burying your food scraps or no food scraps are showing, and then cover it up so you don't see it on the sides or from the top. Keep the proper moisture, so about 40 to 60%. Depending on the site and what you've added in, you might have to add some water, and that's fine. If it gets too moist, your nose will know if the balance is off. So just kind of pay attention, have a good relationship in that sense, and just be patient. Because we're adding a little at a time and not in big batches, it'll take longer. It'll take about 4 to 6 months for everything to break down, maybe even longer, depending on how much you're adding at a time and if everything's balanced properly. Yeah. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact me, email me or call. And then, of course, on our website at ccebroomcounty.com/environment/composting. Cool.
Josh, thank you so much for facilitating a great workshop. We have a couple of really good questions in the chat box.
All right.
So one important question is, I put dog waste in with my compost last year and it turned out quite good. Didn't smell. Would it be okay to use this in the garden?
For pet waste and for dogs and cats specifically, I'm hesitant to. You can use pet waste, like composted pet waste, for ornamentals. So for flowers and such. I wouldn't put them into like my vegetable garden bed at all. Because we were talking about the heat a little bit, the pathogens, the nasty microbes that are in pet waste could potentially survive the whole composting experience if they're not cooked properly. So we don't want to ingest that. But putting it into ornamentals, flower beds, and that'll be fine to use.
Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? I'm also happy to unmute you all.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, feel free to contact me anytime with any other questions you have.
Thank you.
Kind of a lot to digest, but look through the handouts that we sent out to you. That should help point you in the right direction too.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question from Alice about spinning composters.
Okay.
I think I've unmuted everyone. Let me try again.
Oh, cool. Oh, okay. Josh, you were talking about the spinning composters, and that's one of the options in my backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And, but you were saying that that's not a good thing to continuously put things into. What is the best way to time that whole thing?
For a turning bin,
Yeah.
I would try to build up as much material at once as possible and then add it in and then try to get the moisture right. Because that's another thing too, is because it's fully enclosed, you have to be really on top of the moisture management because it's tough for it to just evaporate. So whatever you put in there kind of stays in there. So you can use it in large batches would be ideal and then turn it there. I've heard, that's mostly what I've heard from people that have those types of bins. For some people it works fine. So
how long would that take then? I mean, if you have the one in the yard where you're putting stuff in as you go, I can understand that taking a few months, but turning it and you do one big batch, would that be quicker because you're turning it?
It'll be quicker, yes. Especially because you're turning it and also because the amount of material going in is all at once.
Okay.
So the mixture is right for everything to cook at once rather than slowly adding layers to it.
Gotcha.
And
okay, thanks.
Yeah, so maybe a month or two around there, just to give some leeway. That's especially what they also tout too. If you ever go online and purchase them, that's what they say is that they're a faster composting alternative. Yes, if you're kind of doing them in batches.
Okay. Also, just to give you a little feedback about mine, my spinning composter drips. So if there's too much liquid, it spills out, and I have like a T underneath my composter, my spinning composter all the time.
Huh.
So, yeah. So I mean, I imagine some are maybe built better and don't drip, but
yeah, it's tough to say because we have the one in the middle picture, the large kind of metal one.
Yeah.
And the one at our demonstration site has kind of rusted too.
Uh,
So, yeah, it could probably get some holes over time and then
yeah.
drip.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Josh.
but the pallet bin, if one kind of rots out, you can just replace it with another pallet and keep on going.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yep, yep.
Somebody else had a question about that.
Yeah, Shari from the chat group asked, my sand went out for a bit. If what is in my spinning composter is too wet, do I just add more brown stuff?
Yep, yep. Add more brown and then check on it after like a couple days, see if the moisture really evened out. And do this, you can do the squeeze test too. If you only get a couple of drops, then you're at the right moisture. But if you get a whole stream, then more browns are needed.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, can we give a big thank you to Josh for facilitating a wonderful workshop?
Thank you.
Yeah.
You really broke it down for us, Josh. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ha.
So for everybody, if you take a look in the chat window, I've put in a link for our online form to give us feedback. So we would really appreciate it if all of you would just copy and paste that link into your browser and complete the feedback form. We will use your feedback to plan even better programming in the future. And if we would appreciate you getting it done as soon as possible, we will also be emailing it to you. So thank you again so much, everyone, for your questions. And thank you, Josh, for facilitating a wonderful workshop.
You're welcome.
Please stay tuned. We have an event coming up on Wednesday, May 27th, which is about 2 weeks from now. It's going to be an online wild food foraging workshop. So if you're curious about what kind of wild foods you can harvest from your own backyard, we encourage you to join us. It's going to be hosted by Rebecca Steinberg, and we're going to be streaming that live at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, May 27th. If you'd like to register, please go to vinesgardens.org/events, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.